how's it going, everyone? So this is just a brief sort of After Effects recap. I know that you did touch on After Effects last year, but just to give you just a bit of navigation with regards to the program, where you can find things, how you can import, how you can export, just some basic general things that you don't feel too foreign when you enter into the program. So just to start off, when you open up the program, you usually get a little welcome window that gives you two options. Either you can create a new project or you can open an existing project. So for this instance, I just created a new project. So if you go to the file menu on top here of your top little dashboard, you can create a new project, new team project. You can open up a project, open a team project. This is where you can save as well. You can import, you can export, and you can go to your project settings. So the first thing I'll say is if you go into your project settings, just make sure that your video rendering and effects, that you are using the CUDA setting for your GPU if your laptop or computer does have a GPU installed in it. Otherwise it's just going to use the integrated graphics, which is nothing wrong with that, but just if you do have a GPU, let's utilize it. Time display style, so this is one of the main things that I want to just bring to your attention. So again, under project settings, time and display style, you have two options. You can either work with the timecode or you can work with frames. So I prefer working with the timecode so that I know exactly how many seconds is my animation going to take. Or you can work with frames, you can work based off frames. So it's entirely up to you. That'll display over here around about this area. So that's just the basics. You can either choose timecode or frames. I prefer timecode. You can change it up to frames depending on what sort of material you're working with and how you prefer to work. Okay, then also just to sort of give you a bit of help, if you can notice that if I click, there's sort of like a green, so if I left click, there's a green pulsating circle. If I right click, there's a pink one, and any sort of shortcuts that I use will appear over here at the bottom right hand side. Not all the shortcuts will appear, but the majority of them will. Just to give you sort of an idea of what I'm pressing, that type of a thing. Plus I don't want every single letter to pop up here on the right hand side and cover up some information that could be important. So once you have this, you can either import footage. So if you import footage, just either Control I, you can import footage from somewhere on your desktop, or alternatively you can say File Import, and you can import your files. But for this instance, just to give you a breakdown, I'm going to show you how to create a composition. So you just go to the composition on the top tab over here, say new composition. You can title this comp whatever you want to be. So in this case, it will just be testing, or rather recap. And then by the preset, so I would generally say stick to HDTV 1080p or 1080 25 frames per second. So generally speaking, 25 frames per second is the standard in South Africa. Your height and width is a normal aspect ratio. It is locked. You can change it if you want to. You can unlock it and adjust it however you want to. Then your preset will change to custom. So for example, if I start changing it over here, this is my custom sort of my custom ratio. It tells you exactly what your ratio is, but I'm going to stick to just the HDTV 1080 25 frames per second. I'm going to leave the pixel aspect ratio on squares, 25 frames per second, and then you can set the duration of your workspace. So in this case it's 8 seconds. I'm just going to make it 10. Now your background color is black by default. That's fine, you can leave it like that. So once I say create, you can see that over here under my project, this will contain all the files that I've imported, all the files that I've created. So right now there's a file type that's a composition, and it's called recap. And right now in our timecode, or in our workspace over here at the bottom, then we do have the recap composition open. And over here you can see that there is a timecode because I chose to work in timecode, but your frames can be found right underneath. So in the beginning, when you go to your project settings, timecode display, if I want to use frames and say okay, it switches it. Now my frames are on top and my timecode is at the bottom. As I said, I prefer the timecode. This is entirely up to you. Okay, so once you're in the space, just to give you an idea of how things sort of work. So right now there's a black screen in front of you. This black screen, if you render it out, won't necessarily render out depending on your settings when you render, but it's actually transparent, so you can toggle the transparency of here. So for example, now if I want to bring in something or create a shape, then you would always create a layer, and that layer will determine what we placed on it. So if I go to layer and I go to new, I have various options. So there's text, solid, a light, camera, null, shape layer, adjustment layer. So I would say the majority of the time now focus on your text layers. Solid layers, not as much, because you can compensate with the shape layer, but solid layers work quite well as well. A null, object, shape layer, and adjustment layer. So we're going to be looking at these three, as well as text and solid. So for now, I'm just going to work with the shape layer. So as I click shape layer, you'll see it makes in our workspace a shape layer. If you wish to rename it, if you double click it, nothing happens. You're going to have to right click and say rename, and then from here we can rename it. So I'm just going to call this square. So once you have your square selected, again, I'm going to go through this quite fast to cover up quite a bit of information, because my assumption is that you have worked with After Effects before, whether it be brief or vast. This is just to give you an idea. So via on your top sort of panel, you have your normal selection tool, you have your hand tool if you wish to move your workspace around, but you can do that by holding space and left clicking as well. You have your zoom tool, but again you can hold alt and scroll wheel to zoom, and then space and left click to move around. You have your camera option. This tool over here allows you to move the anchor points of any shape which you create or any null object, which is quite useful. Your shape tool, which is what we're going to be working with now because I created a shape layer. Your pen tool, type tool, there's a brush tool that you can use. However, if you want to do any sort of style animation or frame by frame animation, I would suggest doing it in Photoshop because of the onion skin effect, which After Effects currently doesn't have. Then you can have, that's to my knowledge, please, everything is just based off my knowledge. This is not complete facts, so if you do want to double check anything, please feel free to. If you find out something that I've missed, then you can mention it to me by all means. And then we have the roto brush tool, which is something I'm going to get into a bit later on, but for now I'm going to go straight for the shapes. So you have two main options with regards to how you can create shapes. You can either create a fill, or you can create a stroke around the shape, or both alternatively. So if you wish to create a fill, if you click on the word fill, then you have a couple of options for your fill. You can either have no fill, a solid color, linear gradient, or radial gradient. So I'm just going to stick with the solid color and say okay. If I want to change the color, then I will select the actual color square itself, and then from here I can change it just as in any Adobe program. So because the background is sort of black, let's go for something that's quite bright. And for the stroke, same thing. If I click the word stroke, I have my different options for the stroke: radial gradient, linear gradient, solid color, or none. For this instance, I'm going to say none. I don't want a stroke, and it immediately takes away the pixel size of the stroke. So to create it, my shape layer is selected, and I can just click and drag out whatever sort of rectangle I want to. Or alternatively, you can hold shift and you can create a perfect square. So as I was mentioning about the anchor points for the individual shapes, so if you can see that there's a little blue circle that's right in the middle of the square, so that's the anchor point. Because we created a perfect square, the anchor point is situated in the middle. However, if I create just a general weird sort of square, the anchor point is always fixated directly in the center of your workspace, not necessarily on your created shape. So if you wish to adjust this anchor point, a nice and easy way to do it is to grab this tool over here, which is the pan behind tool, the anchor point. And by doing that, you can see it sort of already places the anchor point in the middle of the square. But if that's not the case, you can always select the anchor point and place it wherever you want to place it. So that way it's fixated in that position. So that's just something quite interesting and nice to work with, especially if you want to work with scaling. The scaling animation effect, whether it be on type or on a shape or on a solid layer or imported graphic, it will scale in relation to the position of your anchor point. So if your anchor point is situated over here, for example, and I wish to scale this rectangle, apologies, and I wish to scale this rectangle, then it will scale from that anchor point. So it's not scaling from the center. So if you want to create an animation that scales from the center, that becomes sort of a problem. So now that you have your square or your sort of rectangle, something that's quite nice that you can do, I'm sure you know about all these different transform tools, is you can change the anchor point, which we're just playing with now. The positionings, this is your X and your Y values, so X goes left to right and Y goes up and down. And then scaling will obviously scale uniformly unless you break the chain, and then you'll scale horizontally, and on the right hand side you'll scale vertically. Another interesting thing would be just undo that so everything's back to normal, would be the rotation tool. So on the right hand side would be your rotation in regards to 360 degrees. Once you reach 360 degrees, the X value on the left hand side will change to 1 and your degree value will restart. So right there it restarted again. So that means I've done a 1 full rotation in addition to the 11 degrees that is adjusted as well. So that's something quite interesting. If you want to do 2 full rotations, then I can just change the X value to 2 and now it's rotated twice. Can't see it now because there's no keyframes, but that's how the rotation works. And then obviously your opacity. So just like in Photoshop or Illustrator or even InDesign, you have your different blending modes for the shape. This is also something which is going to come into play depending on whatever type of effect or animation which you want to create. So you can go darker and multiply. Everything is pretty much the exact same format as you'll find in Photoshop or Illustrator or any other Adobe sort of program. Okay, so now just with regards to animation, just to give you a little brief recap, I'm going to create another shape layer and I'm going to call it circle. And if I go to my shape tool, if I click and hold down, if I left click and hold down, then I get my different options for my shapes. So I just want the ellipse tool for now. I want to change the color to red, and we're going to just draw out our circle. Actually just shrink the circle and shrink the circle, and let's shrink the rectangle. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing now is to just work with parenting, which is something that's going to become very useful if you want to create animations that are linked to each other. So for just a brief basic animation, if I have my circle, I want to start my keyframe. So by starting a keyframe on any one of these different transform values, whether it be opacity, rotation, scale, position, you select the stopwatch icon. So right now I want to start in this position, and as you can see it made a little diamond icon to indicate that the keyframe was made. And if I'm going to move up to around about 4 seconds, I want to adjust the position of the circle. So I'm going to go with my X value and move it all the way to the right hand side. And as I do that, you can see that there's kind of a line of animation which you can see. And once I've moved it at the 4 second mark, you can also see that it indicated that it created another keyframe. So right now, if I play through this animation, you can see that the circle moves from left to right in the time span of 1 second to 4 seconds. So it takes 4 seconds to move in that direction. But if I want the square to move in the exact same position as the circle at the exact same time, what you can do is you can parent it. Instead of copying over keyframes, you can parent it. So over here, on the far right hand side of the sort of information tab at the bottom of your workspace, there's a parent and link icon. So you can either do one of two things. Either you use this pick whip and you can select it and drag it to the layer you want to parent the square to. So if I do that, then you can see under the information over here that it's parented now to layer 1, which is circle. If I don't want to do it that way, I can always just click the drop down arrow, and it will give me a list of all my layers, and I can select which one I want the square to be parented to. So now, in theory, if I play the animation, I'm pressing spacebar to play the animation, then the square will move in the exact same way that the circle moves, but in its own position. So that's a nice way to sort of group animations, especially if you're working with plane shapes or infographic charts, anything that involves multiple elements moving at the same time in the same manner. Okay, so now that we've sort of gone through that, so that was also one of the basics. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to delete these layers over here, and I want to show you if you create, for example, I'm going to create, say, a solid. So a solid would just be a shape that fills the entire composition. I want to give it sort of a bluish color. Just say okay, so it fills the entire shape, your entire composition workspace. And what I want to do is I want to add an effect to it. So there are two ways in which you can do this. If you want the effect to be specific to this shape and only be applied to this layer, then you can go down to effect and you can find the effect that you want to achieve. So for this instance, what I'm going to be looking for is noise and fractal noise. So as I apply that, you can see I'm still on the deep blue solid layer, which is over here, and inside the effect controls of the solid layer, there's my effect, the fractal noise. And you can toggle this effect on or off by clicking this FX sort of text over here on the left hand side. So if I click it and it's gone, that means the effect is now disabled. If I click it again, then the effect reappears. So not to get too much into the fractal noise sort of effect, which we're going to cover a bit later on. But you can play with the different values, contrast, the opacity, or even the blending mode. So let's say overlay. So now I sort of have the fractal noise that's overlaid onto the deep blue. So the only way for me to turn this on or off now is by selecting it this way, or alternatively I can keyframe the opacity to turn it on or off. So this is good if you want the effect to apply to a specific layer, but let's say now out of interest I want to create another solid layer, and I'm going to give it a different color. And I also want the fractal noise effect to be applied to the green. So the one way which you can do this is you can select the fractal noise effect once I've gone into the deep blue solid. I can Control C to copy it, and then go in to the turquoise solid, and then Control V. Yeah, so Control C to copy, Control V to paste, and now the fractal noise is applied to this solid. So it's just a little bit of extra effort if you want to apply the same effect to multiple layers. Alternatively, what could be really nice for you to do, which is a workflow that I'm sort of suggesting to you now, is by working with adjustment layers. So an adjustment layer is basically a plain layer that you can apply any type of effect to, and it will affect all the layers below it. So for example, now if I go back to noise and grain, go into fractal noise, change this to overlay, and just keep it like that, play with the contrast so you can see it. So right now, if I toggle the green layer to be invisible, you can see the effect is still applied to the blue layer. So that way, no matter what I sort of do, so for example, now if I want there to be a shift in color, so if I go to about the 1 second mark, go to my green layer that's called turquoise, I'm going to start the opacity animation at 1 second, and at about 2 seconds I want to decrease it completely. So that sort of gives you a little bit of a color shift between the layers. So that's also quite a nice way to do it, so that whatever sort of adjustments I make over here with regards to evolutions and how it moves, I wouldn't have to recopy these settings, take note of them, copy them, and paste them into the individual effects that I've applied to each shape. At this point, the effect's going to continuously move if I had animated it. So keyframe that there, and by 3 seconds, we're just going to make everything 0 so that it moves. So right now I have fractal noise that's moving as there's a color change. That's quite a nice way to apply effects, is to use adjustment layers. You can rename them so that you can keep track of everything that's going on. So that's quite a nice way in order for you to sort of keep track of every sort of effect that you've been doing. You can toggle it on or off quite easily and see how it affects all the layers. So for example, when we get to this middle point where everything's sort of quite dark, you can see why is everything quite dark, because the color is not as vibrant and we're using overlays, so therefore the blacks in the fractal noise that are being overlaid onto a darker color are now appearing as even more black. So over here they're quite vibrant, and then as you're moving over to the darker color where the transition occurs, then you're overlaying a dark color on a dark color, resulting in a darker color. So that's why the fractal noise then goes quite dark over here in the middle, moving into the color transition. So another thing which I'm sure you are familiar with that's also quite important is to pre-compose. So for example, now if I want to create a shape layer, I'm going to create a new shape layer. This shape layer, I'm going to bring it right to the bottom. So your layer organization is also very important. Whatever's on top will then apply to everything below it. So right now with the fractal noise, let me first create the shape. So this is just going to be a circle shape placed in the middle. It does have a fill of red. You can't see it because it's the bottom layer. So just toggling all this off, you can see that my circle now also has the fractal noise applied to it. And that's because of the adjustment layer that's now affecting all the layers below it. So if you only want your effect to be applied to specific layers, so for now I want the fractal noise to be applied to the 2 solid layers and not the shape layer, what I can do is I can pre-compose. So I'm selecting all the layers, I'm clicking, holding shift, selecting the last one. If I right click, I'm going to pre-compose. So if I pre-compose, that I'm grouping different layers into a group layer. The same process, it's the exact same process as nesting inside of Premiere Pro. So right now I'm going to call this solid fractal. So solid colors with fractal noise, I'm going to apply it. And if I make this layer invisible, then I can see that my shape layer no longer has the fractal noise applied to it, because it's now inside of this pre-composition, this nested sequence. By double clicking it, I then open up and I can carry on editing and working within this fractal noise pre-comp. And you can see as well, you can switch between my actual recap composition, which is the main composition, and the pre-comp, which is the solid fractal right over here, which you just created. So by double clicking it, I then enter it and it creates a new tab. So depending on the amount of pre-comps you have, that's how many tabs you'll have open, each one of them named according to how you named your work. So another thing to sort of also just to know what's sort of going on is that over here on your right hand side, there's a few more tabs which can prove to be quite useful, especially if you know what you're searching for and how to use them properly. So your info tab over here, this is just going to give you general information with regards to color and positioning with the X and Y, as well as your color via with the RGB. So for example, if I have to make my fractal noise layer visible again, you can see the RGB values are changing depending on where my mouse cursor is. So this can give you a good indication of what the color code is with regards to RGB once I hover over the different types of colors that are found within the fractal noise. So for example, over here, the same rule applies. You can see how it changes as I hover over the darker colors and as I hover over the lighter colors. The audio will only be impacted once you have audio. Your preview, so this is just telling you once I render. So at this moment now, if you can see, this bar above the beige bar over here in my workspace, in my timeline. There's blue areas, green areas, and black areas. The black areas have not been rendered yet, meaning that my playhead hasn't crossed those black areas yet. And notice as I did this now, the blue areas went away, they turned to green. Blue areas means that the footage in those specific time areas or frames is still being processed and rendered for you to view. Everything that's green is already sorted and rendered for you to view, so you can play through it quite nicely. So again, this comes more into play depending on how many layers you have. The more layers you have, the more computing power it's going to take for After Effects to sort of generate and pre-render everything for you to view it in real time. So it might take a while, animations might lag, but just give it some time, let everything sort of render out, let it play through by pressing spacebar, let everything play through, allow yourself to get this completely green bar so that you know everything is properly rendered and you can see how everything looks in real time. Then over here on the right hand side, your effects and presets. So this is all the effects that you can find under the effects tab. Except now it gives you the option to search for something. So for example, now I want to go to layer, new layer, create an adjustment layer. And in this adjustment layer, there's an effect that I like using, which is the lens effect. So instead of going to search for it through all these different categories of effects over here by the effect drop down, I can just simply search for it here on the right hand side. So it's the CC lens under the distort, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply it right over here. So it is now applied to the layer that was selected, which is my adjustment layer 2. And then again, you're under your adjustment layer 2 and it shows you what effect you have applied to it. You can toggle it on and off here. And this adjustment layer will affect everything below it, but it hasn't been pre-comped yet. So there's nice things you can play with, for example, the size of your actual lens distortion, as well as the conversions. Is it concave, is it convex, and you can sort of have quite nice effects to it. So that's a nice way for you to search for effects and presets. So you're not limited to anything. You can it will search for you under all the different categories that After Effects is placed in the effects. You can have 3D audio, you can blur, you can have your color correction over here, your distortions, your keying, your mattes, noise and grain, even some transitions if you really want to use. But yeah, so that's quite interesting and quite nice to use. So now by using this effect, I'm now going to have a color change, sort of all trippy like, with the fractal noise moving, and it's all concealed within a sphere or circle type of a mask. Not really a mask, but you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so for now I'm just going to disable that, and this you can work with the circle. So another thing that's quite useful is this align tab. So if I created a circle, perfect circle, a different type of an ellipse that's a little bit stretched, if I want to center this, then I can use the align tab over here to center align it vertically and center align it horizontally. So I can put it directly in the center of my composition. Alternatively, you can move it directly to the bottom or to the left or to the right. But this is very useful if you want to get things to be completely centered, so that you know that nothing is going to be distracting if you play an animation that has typography that's slightly off to the left or to the right. That can really distract the viewer. Okay, again, going into your libraries, so these libraries are linked. So your libraries are linked through InDesign, Photoshop and Illustrator. Whatever libraries you create, they will appear. You can search for them if you create a library. Your tracker, so what this tracker allows you to do is it allows you to stabilize footage as well as track individual points of the footage where you can attach a graphic to, or you can attach a camera to alternatively stabilize a piece of footage in regards to a specific isolated spot on that footage. So this is quite nice. We're going to be covering that a little bit later. Content aware fill works the same as the function in Photoshop, just with video. You have your brushes and you have paint. So overall, this is generally touching on the basics of what After Effects is. Something else which is quite nice for you to see, so over here in this tab you have your resolution. So if you bring in footage and you see that everything is a little bit slow and it's laggy, you know, it's going to be very dependent on the hardware that you're using to open up After Effects and what you're actually dealing with. So you can change the resolution of your footage to half the resolution, a third, or even a quarter, just to make your workflow much more easier. And then once you render it out, it will obviously be in HD. So this is just with regards to your workspace right now. You also have your different cameras. So right now, if you set up different cameras, you create different cameras. So if you go to your layers, new, and you create different cameras, then you can obviously toggle through them over here. They'll be named camera 1, 2, 3, your left, right, that type of thing. So your active view is just your standard view. And you can also change the amount of viewports you have. So right now we have one view. There is one composition visible to us, one angle on it, or you can change it to 4 views. So this will obviously be determined by a 3D space within After Effects. So this gives you that 3D feel where you can have your front view, your top view, side view, anything along those lines. You can customize it to the way which you want. So that's that sort of aspect of things. Another thing I want to talk about quickly is just the track mat. So with regards to the track mat, so generally if you haven't used After Effects in a while, your track mat won't be visible. I just toggled it off now. I'm going to get back to that very soon. I'm going to create another shape layer. This shape layer, I just want a normal rectangle. Change the color to make the visibility of it a bit better. Okay, so this layer I'm going to rename to mask. So your track mat, circle. So your track mat links to masking. And it's a very powerful tool, and you can use it in very unique ways. So right now, if you don't see track mat, if the last option you have over here is parent and link, then your second sort of button right at the bottom left hand side of After Effects is it says expand or collapse the transfer control panels. So once I do that, then my blend modes become available and my track mat becomes available. So what's happening now is I have a circle that is my last layer, my bottom layer, and I have a rectangle which I've called mask above it, and I want to mask the circle to only appear within the rectangle space. So by doing that, I go to the track mat option over here, and I'm going to select alpha mat mask. So I can either do it that way, or I can say inverted mask, and that way the circle gets blocked out wherever the rectangle is. And this is completely transparent, as you can see over here, because I'm masking it away. I'm not adding a black rectangle to sort of match the background, because that's not an ideal sort of a workflow. So I'm going to just work with the alpha mask, and just to give you a brief sort of idea of how this works, I'm just going to keyframe the position of it. So I'm going to start it at the top, and then move to about 3 seconds and bring it the whole way down. So now you can see the circle only gets revealed within the space of the rectangle, and I'm moving the rectangle to reveal the circle in portions. So that's sort of a very baseline into masking, which you're going to definitely cover moving forward. And one of the other things, just to show you, you can also lock your layers so that you can't move or adjust them. Same principle applies in the different Adobe softwares. And then over here by this option you have allow 3D. So this generally is applied whenever you start tracking in 3D, which we're also going to cover. But with regards to what we're busy with now, making your workspace 3D or different layers in your workspace 3D is kind of irrelevant, because you wouldn't need to adjust any 3D properties if you're doing a simple 2D sort of animation. Yeah, so this is sort of just the baseline into how you can create, or just taking you through recapping everything to do with After Effects right now. The last thing that I want to just go through with you is how do you now export a video. So if we have this video over here, there are 2 ways which you can export it. If you want to export a video that is exactly like this, how you see it with the black background, you've done some motion graphics work on a piece of footage that you've downloaded and brought in, then how you would do that is you make sure that your your workspace over here at the bottom is highlighted blue. So if I click over here, my left hand side panel where the project files are, that's highlighted blue. I want my workspace to be highlighted blue. I'm going to go to my composition and I'm going to add to media encoder queue, and this works in the exact same fashion that Premiere Pro works whenever you send it to media encoder instead of exporting directly from Premiere. So then your media encoder opens up, your piece of footage will obviously appear right over here. You can change your settings to whatever you want them to be. So this is just the standard H.264 high quality, and then I can choose my directory as to where everything's going to be saved, and then you render out like normal. But something that I think it might be a bit new to you, I don't think that you've touched on this, is if I want to render this with a transparent background, then the best way to do that is to add to the render queue within After Effects itself. So you can see it opens up a new tab called render queue, and over here you can play with the different sort of settings. So with your render settings, I want to leave it at best full resolution, so it's going to copy over the same resolution size of my composition that I created. And over here by the output module, what you want to do is you want to change this and adjust it to PNG sequence. So PNG sequence can hold transparency, but you need to set it. So over here by your channels, it's currently on RGB, meaning that it will only render out RGB. But if you select RGB and alpha, then it will render out your animation, however long it may be. I think this one now with the circle is about 4 seconds. It will render it out, and it will render out the transparency in the background as well. So it will render out a series of images based on your frame rate, and those images will hold the transparency, and you can then bring that into After Effects again later on as an additional graphic to add, or even into Premiere Pro. So it's quite useful just to know how to render this sort of fashion, and you can also obviously choose where you want to output it to. So for now, I just want to output it to my desktop, make a folder, and we're going to call it testing PNG sequence. Okay, and I'm going to save it like that. And once this is all set up, all you do is you click render over here on the right hand side. You'll see the blue bar sort of fill up, and when it's done you should hear a bit of a ping noise. So it's just going to run through the animation quite quickly because there's not much to do. But again, it is rendering, you can see over here 250 images. So it's generating 250 images from our few seconds of animation. So obviously it's rendering the entire 10 seconds out, because I need to adjust my composition size so that it only renders out that composition. So right now there should have been a little bit of a ping noise, and from here then you can see going into the desktop PNG testing sequence under recap, there are now 250 images of our little animation that has a fully transparent background, which you can then bring in as a sequence into After Effects, into Premiere, and so on and so forth. So again, this is just a basic sort of overview in case you get lost or stuck with anything. The goal here is not to sort of be a proper tutorial, rather just to run through a couple of things, whatever gets missed in the session, and sort of just give you a little bit more familiarity with regards to working with the After Effects interface. So yeah, I hope this all made sense. I hope you could follow along, and it gave you a little bit more insight into the different elements within the program itself. So yeah, hope you enjoy the day. Peace.